Okay, so this is the first of these YouTube lectures. I will pick up where I left off. And where we left off is we had talked through a bunch of potential case studies, and one of the attributes of those case studies is that they mostly focused on a where and a conservation problem, but hadn't specifically drilled down to what the decision was. And that's fine, but I'll use two cases as examples and think about where we want to be in order to do a productive science plan. So one that comes to mind is ANWR, and it's a system that I'm only marginally familiar with, but it's been mostly from the news. So we know that there's been proposals to drill that oil in the wildlife refuge. There are critical species in the wildlife refuge, including things like migratory caribou that we're concerned about, and there are indigenous peoples that live around the reserve that use some of those wild resources. So the question is what's the decision that is being made? Are we talking about a federal decision about oil extraction, or is there a mandate to revise or update or change the wildlife refuge plan? What is it that the science is trying to inform? And it very well may be there, but we need to identify that. So in a contrast, another one that came up was the revision of the Northwest Forest Plan. Well, the Northwest Forest Plan has a geography, and one of the things that it has in just identifying it by that statement is that there is a clear decision process going on, that there is a forest plan. It's going to go propose some things, it's going to go out for public review, and it's going to come back and decisions will be made. And so there are clear things that you can look at with respect to what people were trying to achieve last time and what they might be trying to achieve this next time. And so when thinking about your case studies, really try and think about what are the decision points. And that leads into this discussion about the motivations for conservation. So we could start anywhere with this, that some people harken back to Aristotle and Pliny the Elder in terms of thinking about intrinsic value versus instrumentalism, where Pliny was writing about the deforestation in what's now modern-day Italy and thinking about the value of forests and biodiversity in that sense. But for us, let's start with early in our country's history, and here's a picture of Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir standing up in Yosemite, and this is a meeting of the minds where they're talking about the values intrinsic in this beautiful place, this national park. And this is the 100th anniversary of the national park system. The national parks such as Yosemite are older than the national park system itself. Teddy Roosevelt, I think, established Yosemite, I'm not sure. But in the Sierras at this time, around Teddy Roosevelt's presidency, there was this debate, and its principals were John Muir, who felt that the nature needed to be preserved for its own value, that it did a man good to go walk in the woods, and as a consequence really wanted to have wilderness for wilderness' sake, and that this was something to enjoy. The other side of the fence was Gifford Pinchot. He was the first European-trained silviculturalist and had witnessed deforestation and damage to ecosystems as a consequence of deforestation, and was pushing to establish the U.S. Forest Service, which was established about the same time, might also have been Teddy Roosevelt. And there was a real utilitarian value, a real instrumentalism to Gifford Pinchot's view on things. And you can see this reflected in the modern day, in that the National Park Service is in the Department of Interior, and the Department of Interior is responsible for doing a lot of things that hearken to our intrinsic values of nature, protect species from extinction, maintain recreational opportunities for wildlife viewing, etc. Whereas the U.S. Forest Service, which also has a mission of multiple use, which also includes recreation and protection of species, but it also includes mining and timber sales, that there's an instrumentalism that comes with the U.S. Forest Service being in the Department of Agriculture. And so this has been a tension that has always exists, probably always will exist, and that we really just need to frame our motivations for conservation within those contexts, that both of them are valid reasons for conserving nature and nature's functions. So, and Brian Norton and many people are writing on this over in the late 20th century, early 21st century, and that there's some literature that I'll post up with this, but this includes Brian Norton's Biodiversity and Environmental Values in Search of a Universal Earth Ethic. And so some of these things are in journals, but more often they're in books. Okay, trying to advance slides. Maybe this. Okay, here we go. So, which is the correct history? You know, they're both valid. We've had a shifting paradigm from species to ecosystem-based management in the U.S. over the last 10 to 15, 20, 30 years, and you know, that in itself also might be a bit of an impression that isn't entirely accurate, that we have a prolonged plurality of scale, that we have Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir setting aside Yosemite National Park, but we also have this fellow, Francis Orpen Morris, in 1869, a lover of seabirds, a person concerned with the demise of seabirds, and he pushes, creates an association, garners a lot of friends to join that association, the Association for the Protection of Seabirds, and in England passes the Seabird Protection Act of 1869. So it's a species-level conservation legislation that's 150 years old. And so we've had this long record of both species-level attention to conservation and ecosystem or systems level conservation. So this is Windsor Great Park on the left, where the king and the monarchy in England has long used their substantive public lands, their private land, their substantive crown lands for public access and public enjoyment, along with hunting. So we can jump forward and think about a conventional modernist history of conservation biology, and that it started in the late 60s, early 70s, when we have all of our major environmental legislation, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, the Endangered Species Act, CITES in an international context, that's the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species, all emerge at about the same time. Then by the 1980s, Michael Soule, who's pictured up here in the upper right, is critical in establishing the Society for Conservation Biology, that conservation biology becomes a journal, that there are textbooks, and we begin to have college curricula. There's a lot of classic early papers. I'll go through some of them later on, but in 1994, one that I particularly like, Graham Cawley, who unfortunately died at a very young age, wrote a paper called Directions in Conservation Biology, and really distinguished this idea between small population paradigms and declining population paradigms, and that the biology of populations might even be really fundamentally different if you're trying to talk about a population that's naturally small and you're managing it to persist despite its smallness of size, as opposed to a population that's declining. So we have lots of narrow endemic species that have never had a broad geographic range or broad habitat relations. You're found in particular kinds of places, and that's a very different thing than saying trying to do conservation of the timber wolf or things that may be in decline. The 1990s saw the rise of ecosystem-based management. In 1996, Norm Christensen and a large team of people had a special issue sponsored by the Ecological Society of America. It appeared in Ecological Applications, and it was reporting on the scientific basis for ecosystem management. And every major federal agency in that issue said that they were engaged in ecosystem management. Now, it took until the mid to late 90s to define what they meant by that, but they all agreed to this idea that it was more there was more there than a collection of species, and that they're trying to protect the system and as much as any species within that system. And so, and that in the 2000s has moved on from saving the ecosystems themselves to thinking about the services to humanity that the ecosystems provide. And so these are things like clean water and clean air and protection from flooding and protection from soil runoff and erosion, that these services are highly valuable and that they actually have an economic value that can be estimated. And so there's been an effort to do so. And this has ushered in something, a debate which I'll talk about, called the new conservation, the 2010s. And I think it's a little bit of a tempest in a teapot, but we'll talk about it. So in defining conservation biology, Soule in 1985 called it a synthetic discipline. And although crisis-oriented conservation biology is concerned with the long-term viability of whole systems, so he even says systems biology at this point in time. And he has a very nice diagram where he draws an analogy between cancer biology and conservation biology. And there's some nice things about this analogy, because there's places where it works and there are places where it doesn't work, and that cancer biology must draw from all sorts of disciplines in order to fight the idea of cancer. And similarly, conservation biology draws from all sorts of disciplines in order to conserve biological diversity. A principal distinction, however, is that we can all agree that cancer is a bad thing, and that you'd like to get rid of cancer, and that you'd like to be able to cure cancer and solve the problem. Whereas in conservation biology, although we all agree that we'd like to conserve diversity and that we think nature is good and that we'd like to solve the problem of human threats to biodiversity, that all of our actions in this regard come at a cost, and they come at a cost to individuals, that preventing individuals from exploiting some resources, destroying some habitat, using some chemicals in the environment, and these all have real costs. And so while in general we can draw this analogy between cancer biology and conservation biology in the abstract, that when you get down to specifics, conservation biology, I'd argue, is always costing somebody more, and as a consequence it's just simply a more contested endeavor. And so also in 85, Soule proposed these postulates, some functional postulates and some normative postulates. And the normative postulates are really very important, and that's as far as I'm going to get in this YouTube, is that species are parts of communities, which are products of coevolutionary processes, that species are interdependent. Many species are highly specialized. Extinctions of keystones can have long-term consequences. These are just basic ecological principles of how we think ecosystems work. And that ecological systems have thresholds beyond which they become chaotic and behave in unpredictable ways, and that outbursts can reduce diversity, like major disturbance events. Small population sizes are problematic, and reserves are non-stable because we live in non-equilibrium ecosystems, and that they're changing through time. So these things are these postulates that are drawn directly from ecological principles, and are fairly widely accepted and not very controversial. Over on the right-hand side, we have these normative postulates, and they're the things that get us into trouble, because science, we'd like to be thinking about fundamental principles and less about normative postulates and normative ideas that we may or may not agree with. And so one of the normative postulates of conservation biology is that the diversity of organisms is good and extinction is bad. Now these are postulates that, this is a postulate that has been codified in the Endangered Species Act. We as a country have said that we think extinction is bad through the Endangered Species Act. But this is a very controversial piece of legislation that goes up before Congress pretty regularly, because there are a number of people who say, well, you know, I want to do this thing, and yes, it might cause the extinction of a species, but do we really need that species? What's good? You know, no one's shown that species has been any good for anything, and therefore maybe extinction isn't so bad in particular cases. In fact, we have an evolutionary history of the Earth which is full of extinctions. Extinctions are happening all the time. There's no more dinosaurs. You know, was that bad? So that you can have a diversity of opinions on these normative postulates. Complexity is good, evolution is good, and nature has intrinsic value. These are the other normative postulates that Soule proposes as fundamental to conservation biology, that most conservation biologists are going to agree with those statements, and that not all of society has to agree with those statements. And even though most of society may agree with those statements in the general, they may find problematic support for that in specific cases. So that's how far I wanted to get just now. I'll post this up and see you on Thursday.